Silence isn't peaceful in a blizzard, it's the sound of a death sentence. Beneath 3 feet of packed, frozen snow, officers Tyler Wainwright and Natalie Prescott are losing a war for oxygen. Their mouths are sealed with duct tape, their hands bound in the dark. Above them, the criminals have already vanished into the whiteout, confident that the storm would bury their secrets forever. No radios, no backup, and zero hope. But the killers made one fatal mistake. They assumed the K9 was dead. Staggering through the sub-zero wind, a wounded German shepherd named Sable emerges from the trees. She's bleeding, she's freezing, and she's breaking every protocol she was ever taught. She is leaving her handler behind, not to escape, but to hunt for the only man who can hear a heartbeat through the ice. What Sable did next would defy the laws of nature, lead to a standoff that paralyzed the town, and prove that some bonds are deeper than the grave. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The abandoned Miller industrial site was a skeleton of rusted steel and broken glass, now being slowly swallowed by the worst storm of the decade. This wasn't a place for a routine patrol, but when the report of suspicious movement came in, Tyler and Natalie didn't hesitate. They were the best team in the county, anchored by Sable, a dog whose tracking record was legendary. The last transmission from their cruiser was calm. Dispatch, we're 10 code at the perimeter. Just checking some tire tracks. 10 minutes later, the radio went silent. No distress signal. No frantic shouting. Just the static of the blizzard. By the time the department realized something was wrong, the forest had already closed its gates. Visibility was zero. Search teams couldn't even get their engines to turn over in the minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit air. To the world, Tyler and Natalie had simply ceased to exist. While the town sat in warm living rooms, Tyler Wainwright was staring into absolute blackness. The weight of the snow was crushing his chest. Every time he exhaled, the moisture from his breath hit the duct tape over his mouth and turned into jagged ice. Beside him, he could hear the faint, rhythmic thumping of Natalie's boots against the frozen earth, a desperate Morse code signal that she was still alive. But the thumping was getting slower. Hypothermia was beginning its silent work, turning their blood to sludge and their thoughts to fog. They had maybe 60 minutes of air left, and no one in the world knew where to dig. 4 miles away at the edge of town, a man named Marcus Chen sat in a quiet diner, staring at a cup of black coffee. A retired search and rescue coordinator, Marcus was a man who lived with ghosts, specifically the ghosts of those he couldn't save. He was about to leave when the diner door flew open, bringing a swirl of snow and a creature that looked more like a ghost than a dog. Sable was unrecognizable. Her dark fur was matted with blood and ice. She didn't bark, she didn't beg. She walked straight to Marcus, gripped his sleeve in her teeth and began to pull. Marcus saw the police K9 vest beneath the ice. He saw the bullet graze on her flank. And in her eyes, he saw a desperation that matched his own. "Where's your partner, girl?" Marcus whispered. Sable turned back toward the howling blackness of the forest and let out a single, mournful howl. She wasn't just asking for help, she was demanding it. Marcus knew the rules. Stay inside, wait for the plow, don't risk your life in a whiteout. But as he looked at the wounded dog, he realized he wasn't just looking at a pet. He was looking at the only witness to a crime that was still being committed. The heater in the Ford Police Interceptor utility was hummed at full blast, but it was losing the battle against the January frost creeping across the windshield. Outside, the world was a monochromatic blur of swirling white and skeletal gray trees. Officer Tyler Wainwright gripped the steering wheel, his gloved fingers feeling the vibration of the engine as the SUV buffeted in a sudden 60-mile-per-hour gust. Beside him, Officer Natalie Prescott was squinting through the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass every few seconds. They had been partners for 6 years, a lifetime in the world of law enforcement. They didn't need to fill the silence with small talk. They knew each other's tactical rhythms, the names of their childhood pets, and the specific way the other's jaw tightened when a routine call felt off. In the back, separated by a heavy-duty polycarbonate cage, sat the third and perhaps most vital member of their unit, Sable. The 4-year-old German shepherd remained perfectly still, her dark, intelligent eyes scanning the passing tree-line. She wasn't just a patrol dog, she was the department's gold standard for search and rescue, a biological marvel capable of tracking a scent through a hurricane if she had to. The radio crackled, the voice of Dispatcher 42 sounding thin through the interference of the mounting storm. "Unit 214, We have a report of suspicious vehicles at the Miller Industrial Complex. Caller states 3 black SUVs entered the north gate 10 minutes ago. Property should be vacant. Tyler glanced at Natalie. The Miller Industrial Complex was a sprawling graveyard of rusted corrugated steel and rotting timber, 3 miles past the edge of the county's last paved road. It was a place for teenagers to spray paint walls and for shadows to hide, but 3 vehicles during a declared state of emergency blizzard? That didn't track. Unit 214 copies, Tyler responded, clicking his mic. We're about 5 minutes out. We'll check it out. Copy 214. Be advised, visibility is dropping. Backup is currently tied up with a multi-car pileup on the I-90. Tyler hung the mic back on the dash. You feel that? He asked softly. Natalie adjusted her duty belt, checking the retention on her sidearm. The Miller place is a dead zone for radio signals once the wind picks up. If we go in there and things get loud, we're on our own for a while. Exactly, Tyler muttered. Something's not right. 3 SUVs? That's not a couple of kids looking for a place to drink. As they turned onto the service road, the pavement vanished beneath a foot of unplowed snow. The Interceptor groaned, its 4-wheel drive clawing through the drifts. When the jagged silhouette of the Miller warehouse finally emerged through the whiteout, Tyler killed the headlights. They drifted to a stop 50 yards from the main gate. Natalie leaned forward. Look at the ground. Through the hazy gray light, fresh tire tracks were carved deep into the snow. They were sharp, the edges of the tread marks hadn't yet been rounded off by the wind. Whoever had made them had arrived within the last few minutes. The gate, usually secured with a heavy chain and a rusted padlock, swung loosely in the wind, the chain lying in the snow like a dead snake. Tyler reached back and patted the cage. Sable let out a low, almost inaudible huff of air, her version of a ready signal. We should wait for the search unit, Tyler said, his instinct screaming at him to stay in the car. But then he saw it, a flicker of light inside the main warehouse window. A blue rhythmic strobe. Is that a welder? Natalie whispered. Or a signal? If they're setting up shop in there, they'll be gone by the time the storm breaks, Tyler reasoned. Let's just get eyes on the plates. We'll call it in and wait for the cavalry at the perimeter. They stepped out into the brutal cold. The wind hit them like a physical wall, stealing the air from their lungs. Tyler opened the rear door and Sable hopped out with surgical precision, her paws sinking into the powder. She didn't bark. She didn't roam. She stayed glued to Tyler's left hip, her ears swiveling toward the massive, darkened structure ahead. They moved in a tactical staggered formation, using the rusted husks of old shipping containers for cover. The silence of the forest was gone, replaced by the shrieking wind and the metallic groan of the warehouse roof. As they reached the side-loading dock, the smell hit them, a sharp, chemical tang that cut through the frozen air. It smelled like ether and industrial-grade acetone. Tyler felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. This wasn't just a trespasser. They reached a cracked window and peered inside. The interior of the warehouse had been transformed. Rows of plastic sheeting hung from the rafters, creating makeshift clean rooms. High-output LED work lights illuminated a massive drug packaging operation. Thousands of vacuum-sealed bricks were stacked on pallets, and men in heavy tactical gear, not parkas but body armor, were moving with military efficiency. Natalie's hand went to her radio, but before she could even depress the button, Sable's entire body went rigid. The dog's hackles rose and a vibration started deep in her chest, a warning that came a split second too late. Sable didn't look at the warehouse. She turned her head toward the darkness behind them, her teeth bared in a silent snarl as a red laser dot suddenly appeared on the snow between Tyler's boots, dancing upward toward his chest. The routine patrol ended the moment the first muffled crack of a suppressed rifle shattered the sound of the wind, and Tyler realized they weren't the ones doing the hunting. Just as the realization of the trap settled into his bones, a heavy shadow moved in the periphery of his vision, and the snow behind them seemed to come alive with the sound of boots. Many boots, closing the circle. The red laser dot was a needle of light piercing the veil of the blizzard, a silent promise of lethality. Tyler didn't wait for the trigger pull. He threw his weight into Natalie, shoving her behind the rusted bulkhead of a shipping container just as a suppressed round hissed through the air, clanging off the metal where her head had been a second before. Police, drop the weapon. Tyler's voice was a raw bark, though he knew the wind was swallowing the words before they could even reach the shadows. He drew his duty weapon, his movements fluid despite the sub-zero chill, but the tactical reality was a nightmare. As he glanced over the edge of their cover, 4 more shapes materialized from the wide-out, heavy-set men in charcoal tactical gear, moving with a disciplined spread that spoke of military training, not street-level thuggery. They were pinned. 5 professional shooters against 2 patrol officers and a dog. Sable hit. Tyler commanded, pointing toward the nearest flanker. The German shepherd launched herself like a coiled spring. She was a blur of dark fur against the blinding white, covering the 20-yard gap in a heartbeat. A man raised a submachine gun, but Sable was faster, her jaws locking onto his forearm with bone-crushing force. A muffled shot rang out, not from the man Sable held, but from a shooter positioned further back in the treeline. Sable let out a sharp, pained yelp that tore through Tyler's chest like a physical blade. He saw the spray of crimson on the snow, bright and horrifying against the white, as a bullet grazed her flank. But the dog didn't falter. Trained for pain, conditioned for loyalty, she kept her grip, dragging the shooter to the ground even as her own blood began to stain her coat. Covering. Natalie screamed, leaning out to return fire, her rounds forcing the 2 lead shooters to dive for the frozen earth. For 30 seconds, it was a symphony of chaos, the rhythmic pop-pop of service pistols against the soft, sneezing hiss of suppressed automatic fire. But the numbers were insurmountable. A flashbang detonated between the shipping containers, a world-ending burst of white light and high-frequency ringing that shattered Tyler's equilibrium. His vision went to static. His inner ear felt like it had been pierced by a needle. Before his sight could return, a heavy boot slammed into his ribs, driving the air from his lungs in a sickening gasp. He felt his pistol being ripped from his numb fingers. Nearby, he heard the muffled thud of a struggle, a sharp cry from Natalie, and then the heavy silence of the storm. When Tyler's vision cleared, he was on his knees. His hands were yanked behind his back, the bite of heavy-duty zip ties cutting into his wrists. Natalie was beside him, her lips split and bleeding, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and terror. 3 of the gunmen stood over them, their faces obscured by ballistic masks, while the 4th, the one Sable had tackled, staggered back into the circle, clutching a shredded, blood-soaked arm. The dog still out there, the man with the wounded arm hissed, his voice thick with a foreign accent. He raised his weapon, scanning the swirling snow for the shadow of the shepherd. Forget the dog. It's bleeding out, a taller man, evidently the lead, replied coldly. He looked down at the officers as if they were nothing more than a logistical error. We have a schedule. We can't leave witnesses and we can't leave shells. We do this the clean way. The forest? The wounded one asked. The forest? They were hauled to their feet and forced to march. The criminals didn't speak. They pushed the officers deep into the treeline, where the pines grew so thick they choked out the little light remaining. The storm was a screaming banshee now, the wind chill likely dropping to 20 below. Tyler's feet felt like lead blocks. His ears were burning with the onset of frostbite. Every time he stumbled, a rifle butt to the small of his back sent him sprawling into the drifts. After 10 minutes of grueling movement, they reached a small clearing. The lead man signaled for them to stop. Tyler's heart plummeted into his stomach. There, beneath the low-hanging branches of an ancient cedar, were 2 rectangular gashes in the earth. The dirt was piled high beside them, recently dug and partially covered by fresh snow. They were contingency graves, pre-dug for a moment exactly like this. Kneel, the leader commanded. As Tyler was forced down into the freezing muck at the edge of the hole, a movement caught his eye at the edge of the clearing. A pair of amber eyes flickered in the darkness. Sable. She was limping, her left hind leg dragging slightly, but she was there, her body tensed to launch a suicidal rescue mission. Tyler knew if she jumped in now they would kill her in seconds. She was their only hope, but only if she lived. Sable. Tyler roared, using every ounce of strength left in his lungs. Run. Go. Help. The lead gunman spun around, leveling his weapon at the trees, but Sable was gone. Following the command she had been taught since she was a pup, the command to break contact and survive, she vanished into the wideout like a ghost. Damn it. Find that dog, the leader barked. No time, the wounded shooter argued, glancing at his watch. The pickup is at the north gate in 15. Let's finish this. The leader turned back to the officers. He didn't use a gun. He didn't want the noise and he didn't want the ballistics. He pulled a roll of silver duct tape from a tactical pouch. Natalie fought, screaming and thrashing, but they pinned her down, wrapping the tape around her head with brutal efficiency until her cries were reduced to a rhythmic, muffled whimpering. Tyler felt the cold adhesive hit his own skin. He tried to bite, to move, to do anything, but the tape was wound tight, sealing his lips, cutting off his ability to scream. The world became a series of sensory horrors. The smell of the tape's glue, the biting cold of the wind, and the sudden violent shove. He fell backward into the hole. The impact with the frozen floor knocked the remaining air from his chest. A second later, Natalie landed beside him, her body shivering uncontrollably. Then came the sound. The rhythmic, heavy thwack of shovels hitting the dirt piles. Tyler looked up as the first heavy clod of frozen earth hit him in the face. Then another. And another. He watched the gray, storm-filled sky get smaller and smaller, a shrinking window of light that was rapidly being choked out by the falling debris. The weight began to build, a heavy, suffocating pressure on his legs, then his chest, then his throat. The last thing he saw before the world turned black was the silhouette of a man looking down, the shovel blade poised for the final scoop. Silence followed. Not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, vibrating stillness. The weight of 3 feet of earth and snow pressed down on Tyler's ribcage, making every shallow breath an agonizing struggle against the crushing mass. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, a frantic, ticking clock. He could feel Natalie's shoulder pressing against his, her body trembling in short, staccato bursts. They were buried in a lightless, frozen tomb. The oxygen they had in the air pockets between the clods of dirt was already beginning to thin, replaced by the warmth of their own breath turning to lethal carbon dioxide. But as Tyler lay there, paralyzed by the weight of the world, he heard a sound that didn't belong in the silence of a grave. It was a faint, rhythmic scratching far above, a sound that seemed miles away, yet it was getting closer. Darkness was no longer a color or the absence of light. It had become a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of frozen silt and jagged stones pressing against Tyler's eyelids. He tried to blink, but the grit of the earth had already found its way into the small crevices of his face, itching and burning against his skin. Every time he tried to shift his head, the movement caused a miniature landslide of dirt to settle deeper into the hollows of his neck. The silver duct tape across his mouth felt like a lead seal, pulling at the fine hairs of his skin with every micro-movement of his jaw. He was a prisoner in a coffin of his own height, buried beneath 3 feet of what would soon be his final resting place. Beside him he could feel Natalie. Their shoulders were pressed together, a singular point of contact that was the only thing anchoring him to reality. She was shivering, not the rhythmic, controlled shivering of someone standing at a cold bus stop, but the violent, tooth-chattering convulsions of a body rapidly losing its core temperature. Every few seconds she would let out a muffled, high-pitched whimper through her nose, a sound of primal terror that Tyler felt more than he heard. "Breathe, Nat. Just breathe," he thought, projecting the words as if he could push them through the wall of dirt between them. He began the mental math, the cold, analytical training of a 6-year veteran kicking in to stave off the encroaching panic. He estimated the volume of the grave. They were buried in a shallow trench, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet deep. The dirt was loose, which was both a blessing and a curse. It allowed for more air pockets between the clods, but it settled more easily, exerting a constant, crushing pressure on their rib cages. With 2 of them consuming oxygen and the duct tape forcing them to breathe through their nostrils, which were already beginning to clog with dust, he estimated they had 60, maybe 90 minutes before the carbon dioxide levels turned the darkness from a prison into a sleep they would never wake from. Above them, the sounds were muffled like a radio playing at the bottom of a swimming pool. He heard the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the killers tamping down the top layer of snow with their boots, sealing the grave like a tombstone. Then the distant, metallic slam of SUV doors. The engines turned over, rugged, heavy diesels that vibrated through the frozen ground, shaking Tyler's very bones. The vibrations grew fainter, a receding hum that eventually vanished into the shriek of the blizzard. Then came the silence. It was absolute. It was the kind of silence that made the blood rushing through his own arteries sound like a roaring river. There was no wind down here. No rustle of pine needles. Just the sound of his own shallow, labored gasps and the frantic thudding of Natalie's heart against his arm. Tyler closed his eyes, though it made no difference in the void. He focused his mind on the last thing he had seen, Sable's amber eyes. He had given her the run command, the one they had practiced for worst-case scenarios. Ambushes, explosive threats, situations where the dog's survival was the only way to get word back to the station. If she had stayed, she would be a carcass in the snow. By running, she became their only lifeline. But she was wounded. He had seen the blood. The nearest outpost of civilization was the Miller's Creek Diner, nearly 4 miles away through a forest that was currently being erased by a whiteout. "Keep moving, Sable. Don't stop. Don't you dare stop," he pleaded into the dark. Beside him, Natalie's movements began to change. The violent shivering was subsiding, replaced by a rhythmic, lethargic swaying. Tyler's stomach twisted. He knew the stages of hypothermia as well as he knew his own badge number. The cessation of shivering wasn't a sign of warming up. It was a sign that the body was giving up, redirecting the last of its heat to the vital organs. He felt his own fingers go from a stinging ache to a dull wooden numbness. He tried to wiggle them, but they felt like heavy stones at the end of his arms. Natalie's breathing was becoming ragged. He could feel her head leaning heavily against his shoulder, her resistance slipping away. In the pitch black, he imagined her eyes, wide, blue, and starting to cloud over with the white-out vision that preceded a total shutdown. They were drifting into the final hour. The air was getting thicker, warmer, tasting of dust and recycled breath. Every inhale felt like pulling air through a wet sponge. He fought the urge to thrash. If he panicked, he would use up the remaining oxygen in minutes. He had to be a stone. He had to be as cold and still as the earth surrounding them. He counted his heartbeats, trying to slow them down, trying to make 90 minutes stretch into an eternity. But as the numbness crawled up his forearms and the weight on his chest seemed to double, Tyler realized that even a dog as perfect as Sable couldn't do the impossible. The snow was too deep. The wind was too fast. And the killers were professional. They hadn't just buried them. They had erased them. Just as the first waves of a dark, heavy sleep began to pull at Tyler's consciousness, a vibration shuddered through the floor of the grave. It wasn't the heavy hum of an engine or the rhythmic thud of a shovel. It was a sharp, frantic scratching, accompanied by a sound so faint it seemed like a hallucination. It was the sound of a high-pitched, desperate whine, and it wasn't coming from Natalie. Something was on top of them. But as Tyler strained to listen, he realized the scratching wasn't coming from the direction of the town. It was coming from the direction the killers had gone, and it was followed by the one thing that meant their 90-minute deadline had just been cut to seconds. The heavy, unmistakable sound of a gasoline-powered chainsaw revving to life directly above his head. The killers hadn't just come back to check on them. They had come back to make sure that even if someone did find the graves, there wouldn't be anything recognizable left to recover. The command was a physical tether, a cord of duty that snapped with the force of a gunshot. Run. Tyler's voice, raw and distorted by the screaming wind, echoed in Sable's ears even as the scent of freshly turned earth and the metallic tang of his fear filled her nose. Every instinct she possessed, the thousands of years of wolf DNA and the 4 intensive years of canine training, screamed at her to turn back, to lunge, to sink her teeth into the soft throats of the men in the dark coats. But the Alpha had spoken. The command wasn't just a request, it was a mission. Sable bounded into the tree-line, her paws disappearing into the powdery drifts. Pain flared instantly, a white-hot iron brand searing across her left flank where the bullet had grazed her. Below that, her ribs throbbed with a dull, sickening ache from a heavy boot she'd taken during the initial chaos. She felt the warmth of her own blood beginning to mat the fur of her thigh, a heat that was quickly being stolen by the -15 degrees Fahrenheit air. She stopped 50 yards into the brush, her breath coming in ragged, crystalline clouds. She looked back. Through the shifting curtain of the blizzard, she saw the silhouette of the shovels rising and falling. She heard the heavy thud of the earth being piled onto the men she was sworn to protect. A low, vibrating growl started in her chest, a primal mourning, but she suppressed it. Silence was a survival tool. She turned her nose toward the south, toward the faint, distant scent of wood smoke and exhaust that lingered in the freezing air like a ghost. The journey was a descent into a frozen hell. The snow was no longer a surface, it was a sea. Every stride required her to leap, her chest acting as a plow against the rising drifts. Visibility was less than the length of her own body. She navigated by the internal compass of a predator, following the memory of the road they had driven up, now buried beneath a foot of new white. An hour into the trek, the ground gave way. She didn't see the creek. It was a narrow, fast-moving artery of black water hidden beneath a treacherous bridge of ice and snow. The ice shattered with the sound of a pistol shot, and Sable plummeted into the glacial current. The shock was total. The water was 1,000 needles stabbing into her skin, instantly saturating her thick undercoat and dragging her down. Her injured leg cramped, the muscle locking tight in the cold. She went under once, the black water filling her ears and nose, tasting of ancient stone and death. She clawed at the crumbling ice shelf, her nails sliding against the slick surface. Panic, cold and sharp, flickered in her mind, but it was replaced by a flash of Tyler's face, the smell of the leather gloves he used for training, the feel of his hand behind her ears. With a frantic, desperate surge, she threw her front paws onto a solid rock and hauled herself out of the water. She stood on the bank, shivering so violently that her teeth clicked together. In these temperatures, wet fur was a countdown to a terminal shutdown. The water began to freeze into a suit of armor, stiffening her movements. Every step was now a battle against her own seizing muscles. She left a trail behind her, a dark, jagged line of blood and slush that marked her path like a breadcrumb trail for the things that lived in the dark. And the things in the dark were watching. Sable caught the scent before she saw them, the musk of unwashed fur and the sharp, acidic tang of hunger. Two shadows emerged from the pines, 30 yards to her right. Wolves. They were larger than her, their winter coats thick and gray, their eyes reflecting the dim, gray light of the storm with a predatory indifference. They saw her limp. They smelled the blood on her flank. To them, she wasn't a fellow hunter. She was a meal that had walked into their territory. One wolf circled to the front, its head low, a rhythmic snarl vibrating through the air. Sable didn't have time for a standoff. She didn't have the strength for a fight. She stood her ground, her hackles rising as high as the ice in her fur would allow. She bared her teeth, letting out a roar that was less of a bark and more of a promise of mutual destruction. It was the sound of a dog who had nothing left to lose and a pack to return to. The lead wolf hesitated. It saw the scars on her neck from years of work, the focus in her eyes that didn't belong to a victim. It was a calculation of risk. Sable didn't wait for the answer. She snapped at the air, a warning shot of teeth, and then pushed past them, her pace a grueling rhythmic trot. The wolves watched her go, the blizzard swallowing her silhouette before they could decide to commit. Her world began to narrow. The pain in her ribs had faded into a dull, distant throb, replaced by a heavy, leaden lethality in her limbs. Her vision was tunneling, the edges of the forest blurring into a smear of gray. She was walking on instinct now, her mind a repeating loop of Tyler Natalie help. She fell twice, her face plunging into the snow, the cold no longer feeling like a sting, but like a soft, welcoming bed. Get up. She pushed her nose into the snow and forced her legs to move. Her blood trail was thinner now, her heart rate slowing as her body tried to protect its core. She reached the crest of a final, wind-swept hill, her lungs burning with the intake of the frozen air. Then she saw them. Flickering through the whiteout were small, golden orbs of light. They were low and steady, the street lamps of Miller's Creek. Further down, a neon sign hummed, a splash of red against the white that looked like a beacon in a void. It was the diner. She didn't have the strength to run anymore. She staggered down the incline, her body leaning heavily to the left, her breath coming in shallow, wet rattles. She reached the edge of the parking lot, the pavement a black scar against the snow. Her paws were cracked and bleeding, leaving dark stains on the asphalt as she approached the heavy wooden door. She could hear muffled voices inside. She could smell the warm, oily scent of frying bacon and the sharp aroma of coffee. It was life. It was warmth. It was everything she had fought for. Sable threw her weight against the door, her front paws scratching frantically at the wood. She let out a bark, but it came out as a broken, strangled cry. She collapsed against the threshold, her body spent, her pulse a fading flicker. She had reached the finish line, but as the door began to creak open and a tall, gray-haired man looked down in shock, Sable realized the hardest part was just beginning. She had found help, but she couldn't speak. And in the distance, back toward the warehouse, a new sound began to echo through the trees, a sound that Sable recognized from the training grounds. It was the rhythmic, heavy beat of a helicopter's rotors, but it wasn't coming from the police. The men in the dark coats weren't just waiting for the officers to die. They were clearing the forest for something much larger to land. The Miller's Creek diner smelled of stale grease, burnt decaf, and the wet wool of the three locals hunched over the counter. Marcus Chin stood behind the flat-top grill, a rhythmic scrape of his spatula against the blackened steel, the only sound competing with the howling gale outside. At 62, Marcus was a man carved from granite and regret. His hands, gnarled by decades of mountain winters and rope burns, moved with a slow, deliberate precision. He had spent 30 years as the county's lead search and rescue coordinator, a man who had pulled hundreds of souls back from the brink of the abyss. But it was the one he hadn't pulled back that defined him. Every time the wind shifted into a high-pitched scream, Marcus heard the echoes of an avalanche 10 years old, the sound of a 7-year-old boy's voice being swallowed by a wall of white that Marcus hadn't been fast enough to navigate. He had retired 6 months later, trading his radio and thermal gear for a spatula and a quiet life in a town that most people only saw in their rearview mirrors. He liked the diner. It was warm, it was predictable, and the only things that went missing here were car keys and umbrellas. The heavy oak door didn't just open. It exploded inward, caught by a 60-mile-per-hour gust that sent a swirl of freezing crystals dancing across the linoleum. A woman in a corner booth shrieked as a dark, matted shape collapsed across the threshold. "God almighty, is that a wolf?" one of the locals yelled, reaching for a heavy ceramic mug like a weapon. Marcus didn't move at first, his eyes narrowing as he took in the intruder. It wasn't a wolf. It was a dog, but barely. The animal was encased in a shell of jagged ice, its fur matted with a terrifying amount of dark, frozen blood. It tried to stand, its legs sliding out on the greased floor, and let out a sound that froze the marrow in Marcus's bones, a broken, wheezing cry that was halfway between a bark and a sob. "Stay back," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the old authority of a man used to taking charge of a crisis. He stepped around the counter, his knees popping with the movement. The dog wasn't just some stray. As Marcus knelt beside her, he saw the tattered remains of a tactical nylon vest beneath the ice. The words K9 unit were barely visible through the grime. "Easy, girl," Marcus whispered, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. He saw the bullet graze on her flank, the jagged pink flesh standing out against the dark fur. He felt the cold radiating off her, not just surface cold but the deep, bone-seizing chill of advanced hypothermia. Sable didn't snap. She didn't growl. She lunged forward, not to attack, but to grip Marcus's heavy flannel sleeve in her teeth. She pulled with a desperate, frantic strength, her eyes, wide, amber and bloodshot, locking onto his with an intelligence that was haunting. She let go of his arm and limped to the door, scratching at the wood until her paws left red streaks, then turned back to him and let out a sharp, urgent bark. "She's rabid, Marcus. Get away from it," the local shouted. "She's not rabid," Marcus snapped, his eyes never leaving the dog. "She's working." He recognized the behavior instantly. It was the refined, a search and rescue behavior where a dog returns to the handler's partner or a base to lead them back to a find. But this wasn't a training exercise. This was a plea for a miracle. Marcus ran his hand over her ribs, feeling the heat of her frantic heart and the jagged edges of her fracture. "You're Tyler's partner, aren't you?" Marcus asked softly. He knew the K9 officers by name, even if he didn't hang out at the station anymore. Sable responded by nudging his hand toward the door again, her body shivering so violently she nearly toppled over. Marcus stood up and walked to the wall-mounted phone behind the counter. His fingers, usually steady, fumbled with the receiver. He dialed the direct line to the sheriff's dispatch. "Miller's Creek, this is Sarah," the voice on the other end said, sounding exhausted. "Sarah, it's Marcus Chin. Listen to me. I've got a wounded K9 in the diner. It's the shepherd, Sable. She's shot and she's freezing. Who's she out with tonight?" There was a long, terrifying silence on the other end. Marcus could hear the frantic tapping of keys. "Unit 214, Sarah finally whispered, her voice trembling. "Wainwright and Prescott. They went to check a suspicious vehicle at the old Miller industrial site 2 hours ago. They haven't checked in since the storm intensified. We've been trying to ping their GPS, but the signal is dead." "They're not answering?" "Nothing but static, Marcus. We've got a search unit trying to get through the North Pass, but the drifts are 6 feet deep. They're stuck." Marcus looked at Sable. The dog was watching him, her ears twitching at the sound of the names. She knew. "They're not just stuck, Sarah. This dog didn't get shot by a snowdrift. Tell the sheriff to get every man he's got to the Miller site, even if they have to crawl." "I'm going in." "Marcus, wait. You're retired, you don't have a radio, and the visibility is 0. Marcus hung up. He looked at the 3 men in the diner. "Frank, get your truck. I need the snowmobile from my shed and the heavy-duty sled. Jim, go to the hardware store, break the window if you have to, and get every tank of medical-grade oxygen they have on the shelf." "Marcus, you can't be serious," Frank stammered. "It's a suicide mission out there." Marcus grabbed his heavy parka from the hook, his eyes flashing with a fire that had been dormant for a decade. "I've spent 10 years sitting in this diner because I let a clock run out on a kid. I'm not letting it happen again. That dog just ran 4 miles through a blizzard with a bullet in her and broken ribs to tell us her partners are dying. If she hasn't given up, neither am I." 20 minutes later, the roar of a 2-stroke engine drowned out the wind. Marcus was geared in his old SAR high-visibility orange, a medical kit strapped to his chest and a thermal blanket kit on the sled. Sable was nestled in the sled, wrapped in a self-heating foil blanket, her head resting on her paws, her eyes fixed on the black treeline ahead. Marcus kicked the snowmobile into gear, the treads biting into the ice. He didn't know exactly where the officers were, but he knew Sable did. As they surged into the wideout, Marcus glanced at the small radio he had pulled from his old kit. It was tuned to the emergency band, but instead of the expected chatter from the sheriff's department, The speaker emitted something that made Marcus's blood turn to ice. It wasn't static. It was a clear, encrypted transmission. A professional voice coordinate checking a landing zone right on top of the Miller warehouse. Eagle 1 to ground. The packages are in the dirt. We have a 30-minute window before the secondary team arrives to verify disposal. Clean up the site and prepare for extraction. Marcus realized then that he wasn't just riding into a rescue. He was riding into an execution, and the people he was looking for weren't just lost. They were being hunted by someone who was already listening to his every move. The darkness inside the grave had changed. It was no longer a cold, sharp void. It had become a thick, heavy velvet that tasted of copper and stagnant warmth. Tyler's lungs felt as though they were being filled with wet sand. Every time he tried to draw a breath, the carbon dioxide, heavy and lethally sweet, made his brain throb in time with his slowing pulse. Beside him, Natalie had stopped trembling. Her body was a silent, leaden weight against his arm. He tried to nudge her, to send a spark of life through the 3 inches of dirt separating their torsos, but his own muscles refused to obey. He was drifting into the white sleep, the final stage of hypothermia where the mind begins to hallucinate warmth, convinced that the frozen earth is actually a soft, sun-drenched meadow. Just a little longer, a voice in his head whispered, "Just close your eyes." Then a vibration shivered through the earth. It wasn't the distant hum of the blizzard. It was a rhythmic, sharp clink, metal hitting frozen stone directly above his head. Hope flared in Tyler's chest like a dying ember caught in a gale. His eyes flew open in the dark, grit scratching his corneas. Someone was digging. They were being found. He tried to moan, to hammer his bound fists against the ceiling of his coffin, but the weight of the dirt was absolute. "Start over here," a voice drifted down, muffled and distorted by the earth. It wasn't the voice of a rescuer. It was the cold, accented rasp of the man who had shoved him into the hole. "The boss wants them moved. Too much heat on this site now. We take them to the incinerator at the docks. We can't risk a hiker finding a depression in the snow once the spring thaw hits." The hope in Tyler's chest curdled into a cold, paralyzing terror. They weren't being rescued. They were being excavated like trash to be disposed of permanently. He heard the heavy thwack of a shovel blade slicing through the upper layer of snow. Each strike sent a shudder through his ribcage. They were seconds away from being uncovered, and Tyler knew that the moment the light hit his eyes, a silenced round would follow. 4 miles away, Marcus Chen was fighting a war against the sky. The snowmobile, a heavy-duty Polaris, screamed as its treads chewed through a 4-foot drift, the engine struggling to suck in air through the swirling whiteout. Marcus leaned over the handlebars, his goggles iced over, navigating by the flickers of Sable's tail in the headlights' glow. The old trauma, the memory of the boy in the avalanche, clutched at his throat like a physical hand. "Faster, Marcus. You're too slow. You're always too slow." He pushed the throttle to the grip, the machine leaping forward over a hidden log. Suddenly the engine let out a wet, mechanical cough. A cloud of black smoke erupted from the side panel, and the rhythmic roar died into a sickening, metallic wheeze. Marcus hammered the ignition, but the engine was seized, choked by ice crystals and the sheer brutality of the climb. "No," Marcus hissed, slamming his fist against the dash. "Not now." He looked at Sable. The dog had hopped out of the sled, her body tensed. She looked at the dead machine, then up at Marcus, her amber eyes burning with an almost human frustration. She turned toward the ridge and began to trot. She was limping heavily now, her left hind leg barely touching the ground, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitching sounds. "Sable, wait," Marcus shouted, grabbing his medical pack and the oxygen tank. He struggled out of the seat, his boots sinking hip-deep into the powder. They began to walk. It was a grueling, soul-crushing pace. For every 2 steps forward, the wind pushed Marcus 1 step back. His lungs felt like they were being shredded by glass. He watched Sable, a dog shot, battered and freezing, plowing through drifts that should have stopped a draft horse. She was moving on something beyond biology. It was a pure, unadulterated manifestation of the bond Tyler had spent 3 years forging. "How are you still moving, girl?" Marcus wheezed, his own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Sable didn't look back. She didn't have the energy to waste on a glance. She reached the top of the ridge that overlooked the Miller Industrial Complex and stopped. Her ears snapped forward, and she let out a low, vibrating growl that Marcus felt in the soles of his boots. Marcus crawled up beside her, shielding his eyes from the biting spray. Below them, in the valley of the industrial site, the darkness was broken by the harsh, artificial glare of tactical floodlights. Two black SUVs were idling near the treeline, their exhaust plumes rising like pillars of gray smoke. But it was the clearing under the ancient cedar tree that stopped Marcus's heart. Two men were standing over a rectangular gash in the snow, their shovels moving with a frantic, hurried pace. One of them stopped, reaching down to grab something, a piece of blue fabric, the shoulder of a police uniform, and began to pull. "They're digging them up," Marcus whispered, his hand going to the flare gun at his belt, the only weapon he had. Just then, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of a heavy, rhythmic thudding from the opposite side of the valley. A third set of headlights appeared, but these weren't on the ground. A heavy, blacked-out transport helicopter was banking low over the warehouse, its searchlight beginning to sweep the forest floor like the eye of a hungry predator. Marcus looked at Sable. Her teeth were bared, her body low to the ground, preparing for a final, suicidal charge. He knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. But as he watched the man with the shovel raise his blade to strike at something moving in the grave, Marcus realized there was a third player in this game, something the killers hadn't accounted for in the middle of a blizzard. The wolves Marcus and Sable had encountered earlier weren't just following them. The pack had found the scent of blood at the burial site, and they were already circling the men in the dark coats from the shadows of the pines. The descent from the ridge was less a walk and more a controlled fall. Marcus' chin, weighted by the oxygen tank and his own heavy fears, skidded down the embankment, his boots sending miniature avalanches of shale and snow tumbling toward the industrial valley. Beside him, Sable was a dark streak of desperation. She didn't wait for him. The moment she saw the man with the shovel reaching into the grave to haul Tyler's limp body upward, the last of her biological restraints snapped. She wasn't just a police dog anymore. She was an ancient, predatory force of vengeance. "Hey, we got company," the man with the shovel yelled, his voice cracking with sudden panic as the amber glare of Sable's eyes caught the sweep of the SUV's headlights. The second man, the one clutching a submachine gun, spun around. He didn't hesitate. He leveled the barrel at the dark shape charging through the whiteout. "Drop it," he roared, but Sable was already in the air. Marcus reached the floor of the clearing and dove behind the thick, frozen trunk of the ancient cedar. "Sable down," he screamed, but he knew she wouldn't listen. He reached into his kit and pulled the only weapon he had, the orange plastic flare gun. He aimed it high toward the canopy of the trees and pulled the trigger. Thump. The flare didn't go into the sky. It hit a low-hanging branch laden with 2 feet of snow and exploded in a blinding magnesium-red burst. The sudden, violent light turned the blizzard into a wall of fire. The gunman, his night vision instantly shattered, fired a wild, panicked burst into the trees, the rounds shredding bark inches above Marcus's head. But Sable had already hit the man with the shovel. Despite her fractured ribs, despite the bullet wound that had reopened and was now painting the snow a dark, steaming crimson, she locked her jaws onto the man's shoulder. They went down in a chaotic heap of limbs and freezing mud. The man shrieked, a high, thin sound that was cut short as Sable's weight pinned him into the very trench he had been digging. The gunman with the submachine gun stumbled back, blinking away the red spots in his vision. He caught sight of Marcus behind the tree and raised his weapon for a killing shot. But then the forest spoke back. From the shadows of the pines, a low, guttural snarl echoed, not from Sable, but from the pack of wolves that had followed the scent of blood. They didn't attack Marcus. They saw the man with the gun as the primary threat in their territory. The gunman froze, his weapon wavering between Marcus and the 3 sets of yellow eyes emerging from the brush. Realizing the sight was no longer a secret, and hearing the first distant wail of a high-decibel siren echoing off the valley walls, he made a split-second decision. "Forget it. Leave him," he shouted to his pin partner. He turned and sprinted toward the idling SUV, the vehicle's tires spinning and screaming as it tore out of the clearing, leaving his companion to the dog in the dark. The man pinned by Sable stopped fighting. He lay in the slush, his arms shredded, his eyes wide with the realization that his own people had abandoned him. Sable stood over him, a low, vibrating growl shaking her entire frame, her teeth inches from his throat. "Sable, stay. Watch him," Marcus yelled, sliding on his knees toward the edge of the grave. He didn't look at the criminal. He looked into the pit. The sight made the air freeze in Marcus's throat. Tyler and Natalie were partially uncovered, their forms looking like discarded mannequins. Their skin wasn't just pale, it was the color of a winter sky, a bruised, translucent blue. Marcus jumped into the trench, the frozen mud sucking at his boots. He reached Natalie first. Her head was lolling back, her eyes half open and glazed with a terrifying, fixed stare. He gripped the edge of the duct tape. "I've got you, Natalie." "I've got you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her or the ghosts in his own head. With a sharp, decisive tug, he ripped the tape clear. Her lips were a deep, dark violet. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. "Nothing." "No," Marcus hissed. "Not again." He moved to Tyler, ripping the tape from his mouth with the same frantic urgency. Tyler's jaw was locked, his teeth chattering in a slow, macabre rhythm. Marcus felt for a pulse at the carotid. It was there, but it was a faint, thready flutter like the wings of a dying bird. Marcus didn't have a team. He didn't have a warm ER. He had a medical kit in a blizzard. He tilted Natalie's head back, cleared the grit from her mouth, and began rescue breathing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe. He could feel the cold radiating off her skin, the heat of his own breath being swallowed by her crystallized lungs. Between breaths, he looked at Tyler. "Don't you die on me, Wainwright," he growled, his voice breaking. "Don't make this dog sacrifice me nothing. Look at her. Look at what she did for you." Sable, still guarding the prisoner, turned her head. She saw Marcus working. She saw the blue tint of her handler's face. She let out a long, haunting whine that rose above the sound of the wind, a plea to the universe to give back what the earth had tried to take. The sirens were closer now, the rhythmic yelp of the sheriff's cruisers and the heavy roar of the search unit's Humvee. Blue and red lights began to dance against the underside of the pine canopy. Marcus moved to Tyler, beginning rhythmic chest compressions. Push, push, push. Every time he leaned down, he could hear the sound of the helicopter, the blacked-out transport, circling back. It wasn't leaving. It was hovering directly over the clearing, its powerful searchlight clicking on, pinning Marcus and the bodies in a pillar of blinding white light. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker above, cold and electronic. "Civilians, vacate the area immediately. This is a restricted recovery operation. Any interference will be met with lethal force." Marcus looked up into the blinding light of the bird above, then back at the 2 officers who were finally starting to gasp for air. He was caught between a rescue that was finally working and an enemy that was tired of playing games. But as the helicopter began its final low-altitude hover to deploy a tactical team, Marcus saw something the pilots didn't. The red flare he had fired earlier hadn't just gone out. It had ignited the dried, resin-heavy branches of the ancient cedar, and the updraft from the helicopter's rotors was about to turn the entire clearing into a localized firestorm. The world exploded into a kaleidoscopic nightmare of strobing crimson and cobalt. The silence of the forest was shattered by the rhythmic, mechanical wail of federal and local sirens, a sound that finally drowned out the retreating thud of the blacked-out helicopter as it realized the site was no longer a secret. Marcus Chin didn't look up when the first heavy-duty sheriff's Humvee plowed through the brush, its bull bars snapping saplings like toothpicks. He didn't look up when the tactical team swarmed the prisoner Sable had pinned. His world was reduced to the 2 inches of Tyler Wainwright's sternum and the rhythmic, desperate count in his own head. "He's flatlined. I've got no pulse." Marcus roared as the first paramedic, a man named Miller, skidded into the trench with a trauma bag. The controlled chaos that followed was a blur of high-stakes precision. The clearing, once a silent tomb, became a makeshift trauma bay illuminated by the harsh glare of portable work lights. Paramedics moved with the frantic grace of combat surgeons. Tyler lay stripped to his base layer on a backboard, his chest bare to the biting wind as Miller took over the compressions. Every thrust against Tyler's ribs sounded like a branch snapping in the cold. "Vitals on the female," Miller shouted over the wind. "Core temp is 82 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping," a second medic replied, his voice tight with alarm as he wrapped Natalie Prescott in a forced air warming blanket. "She's in the red zone. If we don't get her core temperature up, her heart is going to irritable ventriculate. We need to move. Now." In the periphery of the madness, Sable finally let go. The adrenaline that had fueled her 4-mile trek through a frozen hell, the fire that had allowed her to defend her partners despite a bullet wound and fractured ribs, simply flickered out. She didn't bark, she didn't whine. She just lowered her head onto her paws and slumped into the crimson-stained snow. Her breathing was a shallow, wet rattle. Marcus saw her go down and felt a jagged shard of grief pierce his chest. "Get the dog in the supervisor's truck." Marcus yelled to a deputy. "She's a member of this force. Move." The transit to the county general hospital was a race against the blizzard's closing hand. The ambulance swayed and groaned as it fought through 4-foot drifts, a caravan of police cruisers and snowplows clearing a path with suicidal speed. Inside the back of the rig, the air smelled of ozone, copper, and the sharp, chemical tang of emergency drugs. Marcus sat in the corner of the lead vehicle, his hands shaking as the heat of the cab began to thaw his frozen skin. The pain of this screaming Barfies, the return of blood flow to frostbitten fingers, was agonizing, but he welcomed it. It meant he was still alive. The emergency room doors crashed open to a wall of heat and shouting. Tyler was whisked into trauma room 1, a dozen doctors and nurses descending on him like a synchronized machine. Marcus stood in the hallway, watching through the glass as a doctor rhythmically hammered at Tyler's chest while another prepped the defibrillator paddles. Clear. Tyler's body arched off the table. The monitor continued its high-pitched, steady drone of death. Again. 200 joules. Clear. Marcus closed his eyes. He saw the face of the boy from the avalanche. He felt the weight of 10 years of failure. Not this time, he pleaded silently. Give them back. On the third shock, exactly 4 minutes after he had flatlined in the snow, a jagged spike appeared on the monitor. Then another. A slow rhythmic beep, beep, beep. We have ROC, a nurse shouted. We have a heartbeat. Across the hall, the battle for Natalie was just as precarious. She was being subjected to active internal rewarming, warm saline flushes and heated oxygen. A dangerous procedure that carried the risk of afterdrop, where cold blood from the extremities rushes back to the heart and stops it cold. Her body was a battlefield between the ice of the forest and the heat of the hospital, her vitals swinging wildly as the doctors fought to stabilize her core. Meanwhile, in the veterinary wing 3 blocks away, Sable was on an operating table under the glare of surgical lamps. The bullet had traveled along the muscle of her flank, missing the bone by millimeters, but the infection from the swamp water and the sheer trauma of the fractured ribs had sent her into systemic shock. Marcus sat in the surgical waiting room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The silence here was different than the forest. It was sterile and heavy with the scent of floor wax and old coffee. For hours he sat in a plastic chair, his head in his hands. The flashbacks didn't come as shadows this time. They came as a quiet realization. He hadn't just saved 2 officers. He had finally finished the rescue he started a decade ago. At 3 a.m., the heavy double doors at the end of the hall swung open. A doctor in rumpled scrubs walked toward Marcus, followed by a veterinary surgeon. Both looked exhausted, their faces etched with the fatigue of a long night at the edge of the abyss. Marcus? The doctor asked. Marcus stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He braced himself for the blow. The doctor's tired face broke into a small, weary smile. They're stable. All 3 of them. Tyler's breathing on his own. Natalie's core temp is back to 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And the shepherd, she's a fighter. She's out of surgery and already trying to stand up. Marcus let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since he retired. It was a collective exhale that seemed to ripple through the entire hospital as word reached the dozens of officers who had gathered in the lobby. They had made it. The impossible save was complete. But as Marcus walked toward the window to watch the sun finally break through the thinning clouds of the blizzard, he saw a fleet of black, unmarked government sedans pulling into the hospital parking lot. They weren't there to congratulate the heroes. They were there for the prisoner, and for the evidence Tyler and Natalie had seen inside that warehouse. The battle for survival was over, but the war for the truth was just beginning, and the people who had buried those officers were realizing they had left one witness alive who didn't need a badge to testify. The storm eventually broke, leaving behind a world of pristine, deceptive silence. As the sun began to reflect off the 3 feet of fresh powder, the Miller Industrial Complex was no longer a graveyard, but the epicenter of the largest federal narcotic seizure in the state's history. The blacked-out transport helicopter and the unmarked sedans Marcus had seen were the first ripples of a tidal wave. Within 48 hours, 6 men were in federal custody, including the lead gunman whose shredded arm had been expertly patched by hospital staff just before the handcuffs clicked shut. Millions of dollars in high-purity narcotics were pulled from the warehouse, a multi-state distribution ring dismantled because 2 patrol officers had followed a routine tire track into the dark. But in the sterile, hushed corridors of the hospital's 4th floor, the headlines didn't matter. Officer Tyler Wainwright sat up in bed, his throat raw from the intubation tube and his lungs still aching with the ghost of the frozen dirt he had nearly inhaled. In the neighboring room, separated only by a sliding glass partition, Officer Natalie Prescott was being monitored for the lingering effects of severe frostbite. Both were pale, both were battered, and both had the same singular, unrelenting question for every nurse who walked through the door. "Where is she?" Tyler rasped, his eyes darting toward the hallway. "Where's my dog?" The answer came on the 3rd morning. The sound preceded the sight, a rhythmic, metallic clack-clack-clack of wheels on the linoleum, accompanied by a muffled, familiar thump-thump of a tail hitting a plastic base. A veterinary technician pushed a specialized medical cart into the room. Sable was a patchwork of bandages and shaved fur. A heavy wrap covered her midsection to protect her fractured ribs, and a clean white dressing was taped over the bullet wound on her flank. The moment she caught Tyler's scent, the star of the K-9 department didn't care about medical protocols. She let out a high-pitched, warbling cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, and struggled to her feet on the cart. "Easy, girl. Easy," Tyler choked out, his voice thick with tears as he reached out with his bandaged hands. The technician rolled the cart right up to the edge of the bed. Sable leaned her head into Tyler's chest, her nose find the crook of his neck, her tail wagging so hard it shook her entire frame. Natalie watched from the next room, her eyes wet as she pressed a hand against the glass. For 10 minutes no one spoke. The only sound was the dog's steady rhythmic breathing and the soft sobs of a man who knew he was looking at the reason he was still drawing breath. It was during this reunion that Marcus Chin appeared in the doorway. He looked different without the high-visibility orange gear, older perhaps but lighter. He carried 2 cups of the good coffee from his diner, setting them down on the bedside table. "She wouldn't let me leave the site until she saw you on that backboard," Marcus said, his voice quiet. Tyler looked up, his grip still firm on Sable's collar. "Marcus, I don't even know how to thank you. The doctor said you were the one who started the breathing. You stayed when the helicopter came back." Marcus looked out the window, his gaze distant for a moment. He thought about the boy in the avalanche, the child whose face had haunted his dreams for a decade. For the first time, that face didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a memory that had finally been given peace. "I spent 10 years thinking I was finished," Marcus said softly. "I couldn't save that child. The mountain was too fast. But I saved you. And that dog, she's the one who gave me the chance to fix my own soul." 3 weeks later, the snow had begun to retreat, revealing the first green shoots of a spring that Tyler and Natalie weren't supposed to see. The department's courtyard was packed with officers in dress blues, federal agents, and a sea of news cameras. Marcus Chin stood on the podium, looking uncomfortable in a suit, as the sheriff pinned the Civilian Life-Saving Award to his lapel. But the loudest applause, a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, came when the K-9 handler stepped forward. Sable walked with a slight limp, her fur beginning to grow back over the scars on her side. Around her neck, suspended by a blue and gold ribbon, sat the Medal of Valor, the highest honor the department could bestow. Tyler stepped to the microphone, his hand resting on Sable's head. He looked out at the crowd, but his eyes kept drifting back to the dog at his side. "There are people who will tell you that a K-9 is a tool," Tyler began, his voice steady and resonant. "They'll tell you they're trained for a task, conditioned for a response. But those people weren't in that forest. They didn't feel the weight of 3 feet of snow. Sable traveled 4 miles through a blizzard, wounded and freezing because the alternative was giving up on us. That's not training. That's love. She chose us over her own survival." As the ceremony concluded, Tyler and Natalie returned to the cruiser parked at the curb. They weren't back on full duty yet, but they were back in the seat. Sable hopped into the rear cage, her ears snapping forward, her amber eyes scanning the perimeter of the parking lot with the same intense, protective focus she had always possessed. She was still watching, still protecting, still the silent guardian of the 2 lives she had snatched back from the dark. Loyalty isn't just a word to a K-9 officer. It's a promise written in action, honored even unto death. And sometimes, that loyalty saves lives that should have been lost. If you loved this story of unwavering loyalty, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a rescue. And tell me in the comments, what's the most heroic thing you've ever seen a dog do?